You have all been fertilizing your orchids wrong. Pew pew! There I said it, shots fired. And I guess today's episode is episode 4 of the hotly debated orchid care topics, fertilization. This evolves around the use of just a purely balanced fertilizer such as a 20-20-20, or using such things as bloom boosters during different seasons. It also relates to the frequency and the strength that you're feeding your orchids, whether you're doing it weekly or weekly, or whether you're doing it less frequently but at full strength doses. So what is going to be best for your orchids? And welcome to the Nature Company. Today we're going to be looking at those different viewpoints regarding fertilization of your orchids. We'll be looking at the reasonings for it, the scientific basis behind it, and at the end we'll discuss what is really going to be best for your orchids and how to deal with this whole fertilization dilemma. If this is the kind of information you're interested in, please hit that subscribe button down below if you haven't already, and that notification bell to be notified of all our upcoming content so you don't miss out on a thing. There's so much contradictory information out there about orchid fertilization. It's difficult to know where, how, and what to start with. So we'll have to have a look at some of these different viewpoints because everyone's saying something different. Use this, use it then, use it this often, and we all get confused as what we should actually be doing to get the best out of our orchids. So let's break these viewpoints down so we can understand where these people are coming from, so we can make the best decisions in the fertilization of our orchids and which strategies are going to suit which plants. So firstly, the balanced fertilizer. They suggest that using the balanced fertilizer is essential for your orchids because your orchid needs all those nutrients, the NPK, nitrogen, phosphorus and potassium, all the time for continued healthy growth. As the plant is growing, it's going to need all of them. And by constant supply of the full set of nutrients, you're not stopping any developmental stage of the growth of your orchid as its natural growth cycles continue. And by overuse of those high phosphorus bloom boosters, they are suggesting that you get weakened vegetative growth. And we all know for strong healthy blooms you need a strong healthy plant. Rather feed with a balanced fertilizer all year round, keeping your plant happy and healthy. Let's look at some of the science behind this. The nitrogen supports the leaf and root growth. The phosphorus helps in the flower and root production, and the potassium helps in the all-round health of your plant. So you need all of them all of the time. And in nature, your orchid is fed during that rainfall. It's that rotting debris and the leachate out of the trees that help feed your orchid, and often that comes in a very balanced format as the rain comes down and runs down the tree to feed the orchids through its roots and through the leaves. So there's not necessarily any big spikes in any specific nutrients at any specific times. They're getting a constant supply of everything. And the plant itself needs sustained energy to keep the blooming. So it's going to not only need that phosphorus that helps with the blooming, but it's going to need the nitrogen and potassium to help keep the plant strong and healthy so it can produce these blooms and of course produce the seeds after flowering, which is what it's all meant for, so that it's able to sustain these flowers for long enough. And viewpoint 2, the use of those high phosphorus bloom boosters. This is used at the stage just as those flower spikes are coming to help produce these beautiful blooms, because phosphorus is needed for bloom and root production. So trying to help keep the plant healthy while sustaining your blooms, or at least boosting the blooms. This is done to encourage flower spike production. Many growers say that they get much better results from using bloom boosters. And the science behind this is based on studies done on the flowering response and the root development. What the science shows is that the phosphorus plays an important part in the energy transfer in the plant, in the ATP production. And this then triggers flowering. And with root development, increased phosphorus stimulates root growth. And this helps provide enough energy to help support the flowering. But always remember, when using these bloom boosters with a high phosphorus content, your timing is important. Only use them as you start seeing the flower spike developing, so that you can use it during that period until the flower is done. You don't want to use it for any longer, because excess phosphorus in and around your plant is actually going to affect your vegetative growth. It's going to reduce your leaf volume, and your vegetative growth is going to be a lot weaker. And weaker plants in the future bring upon weaker flowering. So it is important to understand the timings necessary if you are using bloom boosters. And the frequency is also hotly debated. So whether it's weekly, or less frequently at full doses. Firstly, the weekly is suggested. It's more natural. It's the way your orchids are going to be fed in the wild. It's what's going to happen when the rains, as there's very little nutrition available in that rainfall as it is. So they'll get a little bit of food every time it rains. And so your orchids have adapted to only being able to absorb small amounts of nutrients instead of a big whack all at once. And also, by feeding frequently in small doses, you're going to limit any deficiencies that you may get in the nutrients if you're only feeding them once but very seldom. So let's look at what the science says to all of this. Well, the science has proven that orchids do actually uptake nutrients better when they are in a dilute form. The science bolsters the viewpoint of weekly by the fact that the nutrient efficiency uptake of the orchid is generally higher at dilute concentrations. So you'll land up with the orchid being able to absorb nutrients better, slowly over time, instead of all in one big go. And also, by doing it slowly over time and not all in one big go, you're less likely to have salt burn, because you're only supplying small quantities of those salts at one time. But also remember, when doing this, it is important to flush once a month, whether you're doing it a little bit at a time or not, because salt buildups on orchids can be extremely detrimental to them, especially some of those that are particularly sensitive, like cattleyas. Also, with the continued growth of your plants, it has been found that giving them constant small amounts of food actually help maintain the health of the plant, because it is using those nutrients as it is needed. It is absorbing them and they are available, and you're less likely then to have those nutrient deficiencies as the plant is growing. And then there's the other stance, completely on the other side, saying to use full strength fertilizers less frequently, every 2 weeks to every 4 weeks. So either once a month or bi-monthly. And they suggest orchids have adapted to getting bursts of nutrition infrequently. And they do their best to absorb as much as they can, as quickly as they can, and then wait for the next set. So perhaps you only have one bird flying across occasionally and doing its business on or near your orchid for it to get that extra boost, and then the orchid will accept that as quickly as possible. And thus it's not receiving a full complement of food continually, it's only getting those bursts. And growers that do this insist that a full strength dose less frequently is more natural and far more effective. Also, by feeding this way, you're reducing your risk of overfeeding and salt burn on your orchids, because you're only giving them a single dose and then you're watering them in between. And that watering will then be flushing out those excess nutrients that the plant doesn't need, or that will build up in your media if you are feeding them continually. So they suggest it's a better way of ensuring you're not overfeeding and not getting a salt buildup. So, and now what does the science say about this? Does it also support it? It actually does. Especially those orchids with those pseudobulbs, they absorb a lot of nutrients and then release that slowly to the plant when it's needed. So the orchids have built up a way to sustain themselves through those times of less nutrient-rich environments. And they'll absorb what they need and then release that slowly as they need it. And by feeding your orchid only once or twice a month, you're actually reducing the possibility of overwatering your orchids, because you're not having to feed all the time, which means you're having to apply moisture and water with the feed to your orchid. So you're allowing it those longer times, if necessary, for it to dry out and not allow the media to rot the roots. And also you may be encouraging stronger root growth, because often when you give them minor nutrient deficiencies, the orchid will then start to send out more roots to look for more nutrients, and you'll land up with a bigger root mass, and that will help keep your orchid stronger. It will also help absorb those nutrients quicker when they are available. And there's one other hotly debated section to this: synthetic versus organic. Which fertilizers are actually going to be best for our orchids? Using organic fertilizers, for one, you're applying a much slower release fertilizer to your orchids that can allow them to absorb it over a period of time, and your organic fertilizers generally act as almost a slow release fertilizer, and they are completely natural. So you're supplying your plant with something that will probably get pretty close to what it does in its natural environment. You're also encouraging the growth of the beneficial organisms such as your mycorrhizal fungi to help keep your orchid in a better state. It helps the orchid absorb nutrients and moisture, helping it fight off the pathogenic fungi and bacteria that may be present. Also, by using organic plant foods, you're going to be avoiding those salt buildups that are so detrimental to your orchids. And now for your synthetic fertilizers. These will provide precise nutrient ratios that you may need or particularly want for different seasons or different reasons that you're growing your plants, or for specific plants themselves. And these nutrients are immediately available to the plant. So you can target your feeding for different growth phases, whether it's seedlings, flowering, vegetative, up to you. And these synthetic fertilizers will give you consistent results, especially in these controlled environments, like your homes or big growing facilities. Also, the synthetic fertilizers generally have no scent whatsoever, where occasionally some of those organic ones can be a little bit iffy to the nose, but there are a lot of more modern ones that come almost scent-free. So now that we understand these viewpoints better, how and where should we use them? So firstly, those balanced fertilizers that we use all year long without changing it up. That's particularly good for things like your Phalaenopsis, for Oncidiums, and even your Paphiopedilums. They often like to be kept fed all year round at an even pace. And when doing this, remember, it's always best to feed at half to a quarter of the recommended strength, and do it weekly. So that's where the weekly comes from. Always remember as well to flush your orchids. We want to make sure we're not getting any salt buildups in your media or on the plants themselves. If you're looking to use bloom boosters, then use them on those seasonal flowering orchids, such as your Cattleyas, some of your Dendrobiums, those Cymbidiums. They all will manage using a bloom booster if you're using them at the correct times. Remember, only use your bloom boosters as the season for blooming starts to come around. So you want to use it as you start seeing those little flower spikes set in, and then stop immediately after flowering or as flowering ends, because too much of a good thing is a bad thing. Remember, we want to keep the vegetative growth on our orchid strong so that they will then be able to support their blooming properly. Now for that weekly, as I said, this is done by using a quarter or half the recommended dosage and feeding your plants weekly with it. This can be used on all your orchids, especially orchids that are in media that do not hold nutrition well, such as bark. You may want to feed your plants more regularly when they're in a media such as that your plant doesn't have to constantly be in search of getting enough nutrition, and you can limit your nutritional deficiencies that way too. And by your full dose, less frequent feedings, you're probably best at doing that for those orchids that go into long rest periods. Things like your cymbidiums, some of your dendrobiums, and some of those cattleyas too. These orchids go through heavy growth spurts when they come out of dormancy, and perhaps these higher concentrations will be good for them to provide them with enough nutrition for that fast, vigorous growth that they go through. And then by doing this, remember you're using your full strength fertilizer, but you're only doing it every 2nd or 4th week. So either monthly or bi-monthly. You don't want to do this too frequently because you will land up with excess salts in your media that will burn your orchids. So even by doing it this way, even though you are watering in between, ensure that at least one of those waterings is a good solid flushing to flush out any excess nutrients. And with your organic foods, often you'll find they are superior when growing your orchids in bark or bark mixes, in those semi-hydro setups that some people use, and even as mounted, because that helps increase that mycorrhizal zone in and around those orchids, that if you're using synthetic fertilizers, you may not get any of that mycorrhizal growth at all in mounted orchids. So you want to try and help build up that little atmosphere there around to help for the absorption of nutrients and to help fight off any pathogenic fungi and bacteria that may be present. And your synthetic plant foods can be particularly helpful when growing your orchids in sphagnum moss or any of those inorganic media to allow for immediate uptake of those nutrients that your plant may need. So your key takeaways here should be a balanced fertilizer all year round for healthy, strong growth of your orchid throughout the year. Bloom boosters should only be used just as blooming starts and during the blooming itself, but not afterwards. We want to keep the vegetative growth of the plant in top health, and by having excess phosphorus at points where it's not needed is going to cause troubles for that vegetative growth. It's going to be weak and you'll have less leaf volume. And by feeding weekly, you're getting less chance of nutrient deficiencies in your orchids. And if you're feeding correctly and flushing, you're going to have less chance of salt buildups in your media. And for your full strength, less frequent feeding, these are for orchids that are fast growers and that have pseudobulbs that can absorb that nutrient and hold it and release it to the plant for later use. So full strength, less frequent feeding is for those fast growing, hungry orchids, those ones that produce those nice big pseudobulbs that just store all that nutrient and energy for it and then can release that slowly to the plant. And remember, it doesn't matter which system or technique you're using, flushing is always going to be important to ensure that you flush out any of those excess salts so you don't get the salt buildups and burn your orchids. And if you're confused about anything related to orchids, Ed posts up a lot of information regarding a lot of different orchid related topics in that Buy Me a Coffee link. So be sure to go there, have a look. There is a lot of information available for everyone. There's also some members only gated content. So don't be shy, sign up, become a member and grow like a pro. And thank you for watching. If you found any of this information helpful, please hit that like button, hit that subscribe button down below and that notification bell, bing bong, to be notified of all our upcoming content so you don't miss out on a thing. Help us grow as we help your orchids grow.